Okay, so in this section we're going to cover ratios and proportions, and specifically how to solve proportions. But before we get into how to solve one, I want to make sure that we understand what a ratio and a proportion are. Both of these topics can be covered in 4.1, but since those aren't assigned, I want to give you just a little bit of background. A ratio is simply a comparison of two quantities by using division. So guys, a ratio typically looks like something of the form A divided by B, 1/2, 1/4, etc. All of those are ratios. It's comparing of two quantities. A proportion, on the other hand, is an equation. It's an equation which sets two ratios as equal. Which sets two ratios as equal. And then what we are able to do, sorry, that's not written very well. Let me rewrite that as equal. Now, they may not be equal. For example, 1/3 is, of course, not equal to 1/2. We know that. But what a proportion is going to do is it's going to set these two things equal, and it's going to determine if they truly are. Okay, that's what a proportion does. For example, we could set 1/4 is equal to 2 divided by 8. Determine if that's equal. We know here that this is going to be, but what a proportion does is it lets us set this up, and then it lets us determine if that's possible. Well, how do I determine if these are possible? Well, we're going to get that with solving a proportion, and there are 3 steps that I'm going to use to do that. The first is that we're going to find the cross product of the two ratios. So what basically a cross product means is that I'm going to multiply the denominator of one with the numerator of the other, and then the numerator of the first times the denominator of the second. What that's going to do is it's going to give me a full idea of what these look like. The second thing that we're going to do is we're going to divide both sides by the coefficient of the variable. Now, what do you mean by a variable? What do we mean by that? Well, here, I could multiply this cross product. 2 times 4, of course, gives me 8, and 8 times 1, of course, gives me 8. That's how I know that these two are going to be equal. But if we're going to be solving a proportion, solve traditionally means that we're going to have some unknown. And so we're going to be dealing with things that look like x over 4 is equal to 6 over 8. Or something like that, okay? So that's what we mean by divide by the coefficient. Because when I multiply 8 times x, I'm going to get 8x here, and when I multiply 4 times 6, I'm going to get 24. Now, you remember from chapter 8 that in order to solve this, how do I get rid of this 8? Well, I divide by that coefficient. So that's what I mean here by divide both sides by the coefficient of the variable. And then finally, last but not least, I need to simplify to determine what my value of x is. Okay, I need to know what this is, and so I need to simplify to make that happen. Okay. Well, now we're going to talk about solving word problems using a proportion, and we'll do some examples of these. This is just kind of an introductory video, and we'll work some examples. So for solving a word problem, there are a couple of things that we need to know. I've already got it typed out here for you. And the first thing is we need to identify the unknown quantity. That's the whole key to ever working any kind of a word problem, is I need to identify what is it that I need to know. So I'm going to identify that, and then I'm going to use some sort of a variable to represent that quantity. The next thing we need to do is we need to set up a proportion in which the units are compared in the same order. Okay, that's the important part right there, in the same order. I need to make sure that if I'm comparing, say for example, my miles, if my unknown is my miles, then I need to compare that, the two miles, as my numerator or denominator, whichever one. And then what we need to do is we need to, of course, then solve the proportion, and we know how to do that by our work up here. Okay, so let's get started working a few examples. I think this should be sufficient for us. Let's work a few examples and go from there.